On this week's episode, we go to Rod's neck of the woods for a story involving moonshining, bootlegging, bad blood, and a shootout in the middle of town. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. But before we get to all the excitement, be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button if you haven't already, ding the bell to get notified every time we put a new story out, and if you don't care, give us a thumbs up, okay?
You know, I feel like I'm being profiled by you.
Really?
Because you're saying, let's go to Rod's neck of the woods for this story. And it's like, when we go to Rod's neck of the woods, it's usually something involving moonshining, bootlegging, counterfeiting, bad blood, or anything. But I think this story is about all that stuff rolled up into one, except for the counterfeiting, at least. So,
well, where are you sitting right now?
Where am I sitting?
Yeah, not near what town are you sitting?
I'm sitting near Clintwood.
Okay, there you go.
See, but I'm kind of in a different location than where I'm usually at. I'm usually in Wise, but I'm kind of in the annex studios in Clintwood, so to speak. So,
well, coincidentally, that's where we're going to be today, as far as the story goes. You see, back in 1926, Prohibition was in full force across the country, and Prohibition agents were appointed to enforce the 18th Amendment. In Dickenson County in southwest Virginia, the Virginia Department of Prohibition agent in charge was a man by the name of James Sherman Mullins. Now, Mr. Mullins was charged with rooting out moonshiners and bootleggers in the area, a job made all the more difficult by the fact that just the year before, Inspector Mullins had lost his right arm in an accident.
Well, ironically, one of the prime targets of the Virginia Department of Prohibition in Dickenson County was the sheriff, Pridemore Fleming. He was a hard-drinking man also who, according to the Virginia Attorney General John Saunders, was heavily involved, and I mean heavily involved, in the manufacture and distribution of illegal whiskey in far southwest Virginia. And I guess you could say, Steve, he was kind of protecting some of these moonshiners and getting his big cut out of it, just as long as he gave them protection. But as Attorney General Saunders, along with Dickenson County Commonwealth Attorney Elihu J. Sutherland, well, they wanted Fleming removed from office and they wanted him put in jail. And that job fell to Inspector Mullins.
Well, Mullins had been investigating the good sheriff for some time and had amassed enough evidence to convict him. Warrants were issued, and on August 6, 1926, James Mullins finished his dinner, then left for the courthouse in Clintwood with those warrants for service. Once he arrived in town, Mullins ran into Commonwealth's Attorney Sutherland and stopped to chat with him for a bit on the street in front of the courthouse. And it just so happened that at that very moment, Sheriff Fleming came stumbling up the road, intoxicated, according to Elihu Sutherland. The sheriff ordered everyone but Mullins out of the way, yelling, "Jim Sherman and I are going to have this thing out."
You know, if we have problems saying Elihu, another thing that Mr. Sutherland answered to, Little I. He was a kind of a short man, but man, I heard he could stir it up when he got in the courtroom. But let's just go on here. Without saying another word, Fleming opened fire on Inspector Mullins. 3 shots were fired at Mullins before he was able to get his own revolver out as he scrambled up the courthouse steps to take cover behind one of the pillars at the top. Each of the 3 shots hit the mark. So at that case, Pridemore was pretty intoxicated. He still hit the target pretty well. The sheriff held his ground and on the sidewalk below, continuing to take aim and firing the killing shots. Well, meanwhile, Mullins did manage to fire 4 shots at Sheriff Fleming. And as Fleming emptied his gun, Mullins crumpled and fell to his knees with the last shot. Assuming that he had killed the inspector, Fleming then turned to walk away, back down the street from where the courthouse stood, and was heard to say, "That's a good job."
Well, after taking his leave of the courthouse, about 20 yards away, Inspector Mullins, on his knees, took careful aim and fired, shooting Fleming square in the back, resulting in Fleming's death 30 minutes later. Both men were rushed to the hospital, where the doctors on call chose to work on Inspector Mullins first. Despite the valiant efforts of the medical staff, Inspector Mullins passed away 2 days later, just shy of his 59th birthday. And, Rod, I think you had been to an event up there at the courthouse talking about this, and you had a little bit more in details on this shootout, if you want to share those.
Well, they actually said, he was trying to get up to the pillars, but, when you're trying to avoid, shots being fired over you and fired at you, you're going to try to get to any kind of cover that you possibly can. He got up to the top, and he actually got inside to where the doors actually open up for the courthouse and was able to get there and so forth before Pridemore Fleming hit him with one more shot, and he went down to his knees. But, here's the other thing. There was political stuff, I think, kind of going on with these two men at one point or another. And it was like I guess it would be one of these things of when they take you to the hospital, they kind of wondered, why are they working on Mullins first? Why aren't they working on Fleming? Fleming's the sheriff. Why aren't they working on it? They got to a point where it was like, I think they even talked about 2 hospitals or 2 clinics, trying to get the men there at least and trying to operate on one. And they thought, there might have been some favoritism showed one way or the other. But, when you're fresh off of a shooting like this, anybody's going to be lucky to survive out of it. And that's what ended up happening. And of course, Mullins survived and lasted just 2 days, but Pridemore died within 30 minutes after that last shot was fired. So we'll hear a lot of things probably from, some old accounts. What would be funny is to get a hold of some of the accounts that Elihu Sutherland may have written down and put into an account, because he was there, but, he took off. He took off and really, like anybody else would, dove for cover. And it'd be interesting to see what his notes were on this. Unfortunately, not able to get to those notes as they are at UVA Wise, and they're under protection up there because they don't want people to, take things out of there. And I can understand that, but it'd be interesting to look at it.
Well, one thing we do have access to are newspapers from the day. And the newspapers of the day had a field day with this story. The story of 2 quote-unquote hillbillies shooting it out on the courthouse steps. Now, the Bluefield Daily Telegraph, for example, told a story about James Mullins having a grudge against Sheriff Fleming's brother, T.J. Fleming, over their property line and a fence. Supposedly, Mr. Mullins made a nasty comment about T.J. after his death, which incensed Pridemore Fleming, leading to a long-standing feud. And keep in mind, folks, this is all in context of the Hatfields and McCoys and other feuds that were fueled by the national yellow press in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of it, obviously, as we said before, egged on by Devil Anse himself, who loved publicity. But, yeah, that pretty much was that. And so I guess they kind of figured we were all a bunch of barefoot, gun-toting, shoot-'em-up hillbillies up north.
Don't forget ignorant. They probably threw that in there, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, these stories, though, were later dispelled thanks to the work of James Mullins' granddaughter, Jenny Cooper. Miss Cooper had always maintained that her grandfather was doing his duty and not engaged in feuding. That was one reason why he had never made it to one of these lists that I'm going to tell you about here in just a second, because, they were going on the word of it that, well, there was a feud involving with these two. But her extensive research uncovered correspondence at the time between the Virginia Attorney General's office and the Dickenson County Commonwealth Attorney, Little I. Sutherland, which made it clear that Fleming was protecting moonshiners and bootleggers in the county. And yes, I'm going to throw this in too. He was also going and he was getting some profits off of it too. If you have any idea what I'm talking about, maybe you should see the movie Lawless. That's kind of an idea of what they were doing. The sheriff was getting a cut. He was protecting them, and then he would go and run them in if he decided they weren't doing something to his liking before it was over with. Well, in this correspondence between these two offices, they found out that he was protecting these moonshiners and bootleggers, and Inspector Mullins did have the goods on them. So with these warrants and this planned trial to remove the sheriff from office, it was all put into play, but not before the incident happened there in front of the courthouse.
Well, Jenny Cooper's efforts resulted in her grandfather becoming listed on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in D.C., and on June 1st, 2013, being memorialized in a ceremony at the Dickenson County Sheriff's Office. And, quite the scene there. That I have to say that there was a lot of gunfire throughout Appalachia with these kind of things. You got the Hillsville shootout, which was magnitudes worse than this. But then you've got another courthouse where they've had a shootout between a sheriff and a prohibition officer. And from my understanding, and I haven't been up there to look, but I know you have, supposedly there's still bullet holes there.
Yeah, there's actually some chunks out of the brick. That's about the best way I can say it. I don't recall at least making an effort to look for the bullet holes, but I know there were chunks out. And there were chunks pointed out where, the bullets supposedly landed and where they were trying to hit. Because, it was a volley of, gunfire going on with this. And here's a funny thing, though. The Flemings seem to have this little bit of, I don't know, I guess being a law enforcement officer thing in their blood, because if I'm not mistaken, probably somewhere along the lines of the family, this Pridemore Fleming, of course, was sheriff in Dickenson County, and a later descendant of his would also be sheriff in Dickenson County there for a time being, Fox Fleming, who later moved to Kingsport, and then I think he ran for Sullivan County sheriff, and he ran unsuccessfully at that time. But, the Flemings kind of kept this law enforcement thing, they kind of kept it in the family, so to speak.
Interesting stuff. And I'm sure people are wondering, do you have any family connection to Mr. Mullins or Mr. Fleming?
Well, if I'm correct in this, looking back on it, I've actually got connection to the Fleming part, Pridemore Fleming part. As for the Mullins part with Mr. Mullins, the agent, I've never really come across anything that shows me that. But of course, Mullinses are as thick as ladybugs. Right now with this recent warm spell we've had, you'll find ladybugs all over the place. That's about as bad as what Mullinses are. So much, around. And so it'd probably take a little bit more looking. But yeah, I've got some relation to Pridemore in there and with the Fleming family in general. And, but that's, just from a later descendant is what it is through Fox Fleming, by the way. But other than that, yeah, I've got some connection with the Flemings on that. And I'll see what I can find out about the Mullinses. It'll give me something to do this winter.
And folks, that's the story of the Clintwood Courthouse Shootout. Another story that makes up the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, or on your favorite podcast app. And as we said earlier, please go down below, click the subscribe button here on YouTube. Ding the bell so you get notified every time we put a new story out. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.